Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the escalation in the relationship between North Korea, its neighbors in certain instances, and also, of course, the United States. We're talking about it with the former U.S. ambassador to South Korea and former Assistant Secretary of State Christopher Hill, who's with the University of Denver. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Adam Cathcart of Leeds University, who joins us from Northern England, the author of Change and Continuity in North Korean Politics. From Manchester, North Korean exile Ji-yoon Park, who's with the European Alliance for Human Rights in North Korea. And also joining us, Benoit Kennedy, Vice President of the France-Korea Friendship Association. Welcome back to the show. Before I ask about how China is reacting to the latest developments, I want to point out, Ambassador Hill, that we've seen few statements from the Trump administration. We had the White House spokesperson, Sean Spicer, warning of very dire consequences after that missile launch by North Korea on Monday. The White House saying that the president emphasizing steps to enhance our ability to deter and defend against North Korea's ballistic missiles using the full range of the United States military capabilities. We also saw written statements from the State Department, but there hasn't been, it seems, that much in terms of public pronouncements. Why is that? Is Korea something that's not high on Donald Trump's mind?
Well, I think Korea is probably going to be the highest foreign policy issue on Donald Trump's mind, probably more so than the continued crisis in Syria and the broader Middle East. I think the real problem, if people have been following the events in Washington, the real problem is it has taken this administration a long time to get itself organized to govern. It's pretty clear that the Trump administration came into office somewhat surprised that they had won the election. By this time, in previous transfers of power, I mean, you've had a lot more people named and approved by the Senate. I recall when I came into the assistant secretaryship, I was already named in December and approved in January, and I think they're a long way off from getting an assistant secretary for Asian affairs. So I think they've kind of relied on old talking points and certainly on reassuring allies such as Japan and South Korea. But they clearly are not kind of ready. You normally want to have some studies of what's been done before. What should our position be? I think during this four-year Trump term, we're going to see administration that will take a very tough view on North Korea. Will not be talking about strategic patience, but rather will be kind of pushing things really hard. The real issue is not that they haven't kind of come up with a policy of their own, which they really haven't yet. The real issue is that when you look at the menu of those policies, there's nothing terribly appealing. I mean, after all, you have 14,000 artillery pieces aimed at population centers in South Korea. So, just kind of threatening war is not necessarily a good approach to take. And so I think the Trump administration is kind of back on their heels when they look at the kind of paucity of any really good options. Certainly one of the good options is the full deployment of this terminal high altitude area defense weapon, which is one of the most successful elements of anti-missile defense, and I think will provide a measure of assistance here. It's obviously upset the Chinese, but frankly, the Chinese need to understand that as long as they don't kind of sit on the North Koreans, and whether or not they've denied them or they've stopped these coal exports, they really have not been successful in terms of reining in North Korea. So they need to understand that we're not going to sit around and advocate patience. We're going to try to do some things, and certainly THAAD is one of them. So I think the Chinese are really going to have to step up their game. I don't think there's any outsourcing of this problem to China. I think China has to work with the United States and others on this, but China can't be advocating patience to us, because I think we've gotten to the point where this is getting very, very dangerous.
Getting to the point where it's very, very dangerous. Let me ask Adam Cathcart, how dangerous is it? And you were mentioning in part one of our discussion how the Chinese were wavering in their support of Pyongyang, the deployment of this missile shield by the U.S. and South Korea. Is that going to change Beijing's mind?
Well, if anything, the deployment of the missile shield, according to the people around Xi Jinping who made up his mind long ago that this was bad for China's national interest and was aimed against China and was part of the plot to contain China, this 中国威胁论, they call it, the theory to contain China or to intimidate China. I don't think he's going to be terribly moved to change and to put more pressure on Pyongyang as a result of THAAD. In the long term, it's hard to see that. And when you talk to Chinese scholars and sort of party people in sort of more relaxed moments, they will tell you that there's no space inside of China to be debating against THAAD. There is no domestic push against this. So the American logic that somehow China's going to feel the pain because of THAAD, and this is going to create antagonism toward North Korea among the Chinese populace, whose information is controlled by the CCP or the Chinese Communist Party, it's a bit of an overly complex equation. I think what the THAAD deployment means, though, and it shows China's willingness to really put pressure on South Korea, both economically and in other ways. And that means, by definition, that it's better news for Pyongyang. So one of the things that we've seen, even after the most recent big test of February 2017, is you had a lot of speculation, including people by people like me, about sort of these coal exports, and China was really putting the screws down on North Korea. And then you had a vice foreign minister going to Beijing from Pyongyang and spending 4 or 5 days. And all that goes more or less unreported. There wasn't much big splash there, but they've got time to talk to one another. It may be that the most recent missile test was choreographed or telegraphed to the Chinese Communist Party by the North Koreans. So I think it's a long-term party-to-party relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the Korean Workers' Party. And issues like Ji-hyun Park talked about, sort of North Korean refugees, it's part of the relationship. But I think China's not too worried about sort of the big picture, in the sense that North Korea has a certain amount of danger, but it also has a certain amount of advantage in keeping the region in balance. So they're willing to live with it, I think.
All right. It sounds from what you're saying that North Korea sort of has a plan. They know what they're doing. Ji-hyun Park, what are your thoughts on the way that South Korea and the United States are handling all of this?
On Sunday, North Korea launched the missile test, and after now, USA and South Korea published some about warning letter. But it's China. China is still the friendship North Korea government, but the Chinese government don't think about the North Korean refugees. They say that North Korean refugees, illegal migrant people. So North Korean government sent back the North Korean refugees who lives in China. So nowadays, many North Korean refugees are dangerous in China side, and many North Korean women human trafficking or sex traded in Chinese place, and also 20,000 the child who was born in North Korean mother and born in China. They denied their nationality and ID cards. So many children is now no options to go to the school, or they illness, they can't go to hospital freely.
Yeah, they're basically with no status. Christopher Hill, I know you have to leave us, so just one final quick question on this. Are ordinary Koreans being forgotten in the mix?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, look, dealing with North Korea, you cannot solve this problem by just thickening up missile defense. You cannot solve this problem by just outsourcing issues to China. You need a kind of comprehensive strategy. You need it to be sort of up there at the top of the agenda of the administration. I think it is. I think in terms of the refugees from North Korea, I think South Korea has done a pretty good job. They get a lot of criticism for what they do, but I think they've done a good job. And frankly speaking, I think the United States needs to do a better job on this. I think the most complex part of this whole equation is China. The U.S. is not trying to deploy THAAD in order to threaten the Chinese so that the Chinese will somehow do more to North Korea. I don't think it's quite that convoluted. I think what the United States is trying to do is tell the South Korean people that the United States takes seriously its obligations under the alliance to help South Korea protect itself from North Korea. The Chinese have been very upset about that because they feel that they have always had the view that the U.S. Exaggerates the threat from North Korea, or worse yet, uses the threat from North Korea as a sort of proxy for a sort of contained China policy. And the Chinese have kind of held to this position, or I should say, many Chinese believe this. And I think the solution to this is the U.S. and China need to have a kind of deep dive on our mutual views on North Korea. I think one of those issues has to be what China's opinion would be of an eventual unification of the Korean Peninsula under the successor state, the Republic of Korea. So here the U.S. needs to be careful not to be doing things over the heads of the South Koreans. After all, the whole purpose is to work with South Korea. So they have to be careful that South Koreans don't feel that the U.S. is trying to cut some deal with China. At the same time, I think the U.S. needs to be pretty clear to the Chinese that if they are so interested in stability, they may not be getting stability with the likes of Kim Jong-un, and that the U.S., together with the South Koreans, have no intention of diminishing China's strategic position, that is, of putting listening posts on the Yalu River or troops up on the Yalu River or something like this. And so I think there needs to be a much more serious dialogue with the Chinese. And this is where I think the Trump administration needs to start setting some priorities. If they really want a trade war with China, maybe this isn't a particularly good time for that. If they really want to go very confrontational with China, that's certainly not going to be matched by an ability to work with China on North Korea, because I think the Chinese tend to put this all together, and I think the Chinese are kind of worried about how this new administration is looking at China, the whole issue, the whole kerfuffle earlier about the one China policy. These kinds of things are kind of damaging in terms of the ability to work systematically and in depth with the Chinese over an issue that, frankly speaking, I mean, North Korea is not ever going to be a stable element in Northeast Asia. And the sooner the Chinese understand that their future would be better served by a united Korean Peninsula, the better.
Ambassador Hill, many thanks for joining us here in the France 24 debate. I want to turn now to Benoit Kennedy and your reaction to what you heard. What are your views on breaking the impasse? You just heard Christopher Hill say that at some point, the U.S. and China, if they tone down their rhetoric, if they can see what those two big nations agree upon, that will perhaps have a solution when it comes to Korea.
Yes, it is very important because China, of course, it sides with North Korea concerning THAAD, but it is not so simple. China strongly opposes the nuclear military program of North Korea, so China wants stability first. And it is also very important because in the past, when there was resolutions in the United Nations concerning North Korea, both China and the United States side together. So now it is a very difficult position for China because not only China, but also Russia strongly opposed the THAAD system. On one important position, because we heard about reaction in South Korea, we have to know that in South Korea, in upcoming weeks or months, mostly month, there will be an presidential election in South Korea.
Yeah.
The president sides with the conservative, but she was impeached in last December.
And she could be removed from office soon.
She could be moved maybe as soon as this week. So it means that we have also to take into account the position of the South Korean public opinion. And concerning the South Korean public opinion, she's strongly opposed to the THAAD system. So now the South Korean public opinion got the impression that they are trying to get the THAAD system as soon as possible. Because if opposition wins the next presidential election in South Korea, which is a strong probability, the South Korean opposition said that they oppose to the THAAD system. So every time there was diplomatic wars around the North Korean peninsula, in the long run, people discussed together. As was said by Mr. Ambassador Hill, every time the United States got the impression that they sold twice the same horse.
So now they accept to discuss, but only if there is something to discuss. So in this configuration, two important actors can play a big role. Of course, China, because China wants stability on the Korean Peninsula. We can imagine, for example, that China could say to the United States, well, okay, just go away, just stop the THAAD system, and we can promise you that we'll try to push on North Korea not to have nuclear weapons any longer. We can imagine such a process. The problem is North Korea is not a satellite of China, so it is very difficult.
It's its own country.
Yes. Another point which is important, Donald Trump, what is your opinion about it? Because we listen a lot about the diplomats, we listen a lot about the State Department, but what does Mr. Trump think about it? It is his first big international crisis. How will he react? And Mr. Trump told he was a way to take an hamburger with the leader, the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. I don't know if he will take an hamburger, but concerning him, he has to reach an agreement to show that he's a strong leader. So maybe Russia, which is another important actor, Russia, which also opposed to the THAAD system, he has good relations with Russia. Maybe we can imagine that Mr. Putin will take a role in such a configuration. It will be for Russia, which aspires to have a bigger part in the Korean Peninsula, to play a bigger role. It is a possibility.
Adam Cathcart, what is your guess on how Donald Trump sees the resolution of what's the crisis with North Korea?
Well, I think Donald Trump's views of East Asia are locked into a rather, maybe a point of view that's 20, 30 years old, and those are slowly getting updated. I think one of the most interesting things, just to branch off of what Benoit was talking about, is how the Abe Shinzo, the Japanese Prime Minister, Donald Trump relationship has really seemed to take priority over the Trump administration's contacts with South Korea. Michael Flynn, who the now deposed, resigned, fired, whatever, national security advisor, had met with counterparts in South Korea. They seem to be moving forward, Defense Secretary Mattis, with a rather traditional approach, the Americans are, and this THAAD deployment is certainly part of that, as Ambassador Hill mentioned, kind of robust support of the alliance. So there are these kind of structural things moving forward, but this relationship between Abe and Trump is, we could see a kind of bifurcation in the year ahead, where U.S.-Japan relations actually are quite solid, where the Japanese right wing or center-right party, the LDP, feels emboldened to sort of take more vigorous steps against North Korea. But we have an election in South Korea where the United States has maybe overplayed its hand, where China's anti-THAAD propaganda and its kind of holding the sword over the South Korean economy has actually worked, and the South Korean left then goes for a candidate who wants to sort of move the United States anti-missile program out. Ultimately, maybe doesn't even want to see the Americans there at all.
Adam, let's just give some context on let's give some
ties.
context on that point, because it's important about how it's putting a strain on ties between China and South Korea. The South Korean conglomerate Lotte finds itself in the eye of the storm for swapping land it owned so that the missile defense shield could be deployed there. It's now the target of a boycott and claims it was the subject of a cyber attack launched by hacks with Chinese IP addresses. Seoul denouncing retaliatory measures by Beijing and say it may file a complaint with the World Trade Organization.
Well, I think this is the problem.
China is taking measures against the deployment of THAAD in several ways. We will continue to maintain our stance that the deployment of THAAD is an action taken based on our right to self-defense, for our national security, and the safety of our people.
Adam Cathcart.
Well, I think this is part of the problem with thinking that the North Korean-Chinese relationship is going to implode. You see a very vigorous movement spearheaded by the Chinese Communist Party to oppose the deployment of THAAD, and in Chinese media it's been, which I read every day, it's been overwhelmingly anti-South Korean versus anti-North Korean, in spite of the fact that North Korea has been engaging in what are termed in our media sphere provocations. Just to come back very quickly, though, to something Ji-hyun Park mentioned, and this kind of, and that Ambassador Hill mentioned as well, to connect these 2 points. The Trump administration has really failed under Rex Tillerson to put any human rights pressure on North Korea at all. There was no spokesman for the State Department who's willing to put his or her name on a recent broad human rights report that included North Korea. There's been little discussion about the reappointment of a special envoy for human rights. There's a lot of traditional energy in the American body politic, as well as in South Korea, that is mobilized and organized around critiquing North Korean human rights and of advocating for North Korean refugees in China. That is completely absent. So people like Samantha Power at the United Nations, Barack Obama's ambassador there, was extremely vigorous, getting to know North Korean defectors. The Secretary of State, John Kerry. I know that the Republican Party is no fan necessarily of John Kerry, but you have to say that Kerry and Power were much, much stronger on the human rights issue than this so-called Christian conservative government that we see in Washington today. So it's a very, very, there's some very prickly relations going on now, I think, within the Trump administration, and there's some, I would hope, some kind of an internal discussion about, is this human rights pressure going to be brought to bear on North Korea, or is that something we choose to give up in the hopes that negotiating with North Korea, that they'll sort of say, oh, well, thank you for reducing at least that pressure. You can talk about assassinating our leader and cyber hacking our missile program, but thanks for not going after us in the human rights issue. I'm not sure that the United States has much to gain by taking the foot off the accelerator in that front.
Adam Cathcart, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us from Leeds. I want to thank as well Ji-Yoon Park for being with us from Manchester. Benoit Kennedy, stay with us because Media Watch is next. We say hello to James Creedon. I want to rebound on what we just heard Adam Cathcart talk about, which is how he's been reading the Chinese media every day, and it's squarely pointed at South Korea, not North Korea.
That's right. There are real tensions here emerging between Beijing and Seoul. And the looking at the Korean media here, the South Korean media, they're talking about how the tourism sector is really likely to take a big, big hit now in what is essentially retaliation. It's not even being hidden.
China is South Korea's #1 trading partner by a long shot.
That's right. And last year there were 17 million tourists that visited South Korea. About half of them, some 8 million, came from China. So if those numbers begin to drop dramatically, the tourism sector could seriously take a hit in South Korea. And they were expecting or hoping for 20 million visitors next year. That looks highly unlikely now because there is almost certainly going to be a drop in Chinese tourism. This article in the Korea Herald is talking about just that, and they detail 2 points in this article. First of all, the fact that the computer seems to be frozen, but the fact that South Korean carriers in China have essentially been refused access, if you like, and Chinese carriers are likely to also diminish the number of their flights going in. I think we might have something back now. In any case, the number of tourists visiting is likely to go way down. Now, there was also the Global Times, which is essentially a mouthpiece for the Chinese government, and they said, we don't want to make the country bleed. They were talking about South Korea, but we'd better make it hurt. So, I mean, it's an example of things really not being hidden that much at all. Francois. Now, meanwhile, K-dramas and K-pop, this is Hallyu, is the term used in South Korea, which is essentially the Korean soft power. That is being massively restricted in China as well. A lot of these K-dramas have disappeared off the airwaves of Chinese television. There was even one case, which unfortunately I can't show you right now, but here we go, we seem to be back in business. K-pop, right? So there's massive restrictions on K-pop as well. And as this article in the South, in the Sydney Morning Herald points out, right now, cosmetics companies, that's imports, TV shows, and South Korean pop stars, i.e. K-pop, are the most affected. There was even one rather bizarre incident. This is a guy called Hyang Chi-yul. He was appearing in a Chinese reality TV show, and overnight he was replaced by, I'm not sure if I'm going to have sound on this, but he was replaced overnight by a Hong Kongese actor. So just overnight, he was taken off the show and replaced. So he's I think a 34-year-old South Korean singer, quite well known, and he was participating in this show, and then he's gone. So if that's not a sign that they're serious about tightening the screws on South Korean cultural presence in China, then I don't know what is. But certainly Haiyu, as it's called, is being seriously impacted on. And indeed, this was a wave of Korean culture that was an exportation of Korean culture that started in the early 90s, and it started in China. China is actually the cradle, if you like, in terms of a space where South Korean culture was being exported to before it went to Japan and other countries. But it's a huge factor in South Korean soft power, and also it's a big money spinner. You have their dramas and their pop stars selling even in places like Latin America, rather improbably. But so certainly, as the Global Times said, they are going to make South Korea hurt for this decision over the THAAD missiles.
All right, serious stuff when you're stopping K-pop stars
Indeed.
from going to China. I want to thank you, James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.